United we're as strong as a mountain. United.
My name is Steve Zeltzer. I'm with Workweek and a producer at Pacifica. And also I am with the United Front Committee for Labor Party. The developments of the crisis, the economic crisis, world economic crisis, and the wars that the United States are engaging in around the world in Venezuela and the threatened attack on Iran represent a new level of both political and economic crisis. And I think the issue of building an alternative economic system to U.S. capitalism is what BRICS is about. And we're going to hear from Patrick Bond, who is a professor at the University of Johannesburg and has been writing for decades on this issue of economic development in Africa and around the world, the role of the U.S. capitalist organizations, and also the development of BRICS. And BRICS has been presented as a vehicle to be an alternative to the U.S.-controlled financial structures around the world. And what we're going to talk about is what is the reality of BRICS, and especially what is the reality of BRICS in light of the U.S. policy, now military policy, of taking over Venezuela and militarily intervening on a global level. So without further ado, I'll introduce Patrick Bond.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be with your team, Steve, and the general ability to work out what workers' interests are, and community and environmental, feminist, youth, all of the different forces that we need to be bringing together. And Africa is especially poignant, and South Africa very interesting because of big geopolitical processes, some of which you've touched on, is the warring sort of processes are getting more and more wicked. Particularly the Trump regime, switching between a paleo-conservative xenophobia and a neoconservative aggression. And the hemisphere here being the site not only of the actual kidnapping of a head of state, Maduro, and the kind of occupation of oil fields, but potential threats to Colombia, Cuba, to Panama, to Mexico, to Greenland, although it looks like at the Davos meeting that Trump walked some of that back. It's really important, I think, to talk to each other about context, because this isn't happening in a vacuum, and MAGA hasn't arisen, the Make America Great Again conservatism, without the deeper processes of capitalist and ecological meltdowns and all sorts of politics that are emerging because of these crises. So what I've tried to write and want to continue and develop in the next analysis, which will be published not too far into the future in a book called Extreme Uneven Development. What I want to do is think about whether labor strategies are up sufficiently for this challenge of capitalism that has deep, deep problems that it doesn't seem are being resolved, they're being amplified. And in fact, we've often talked about how tensions and the sort of crises of capitalism create geopolitical friction. But I think I want to also introduce something I see very explicitly in Johannesburg, namely the deindustrialization that's much more rapid since Trump's tariffs. And it's not only because South Africa was picked out to be bullied by Trump, but the Chinese excess production that would have gone into the U.S. economy, about 20% decline in exports, well, those go somewhere else. Where they go, we'll talk about. I think the crucial point for me was realizing on November 22nd and 23rd last year, the G20 met in Johannesburg. Johannesburg is the richest city in world history if you look at the sort of half of the world's gold underneath it at peak in 1970. And of course, it's all been depleted, it's looted, and the city's falling apart. My own neighborhood, middle-class academic sort of bohemian site called Melville, we don't have water most evenings now because they have to turn off the water at night because the reservoirs would leak out because there's so many broken pipes that they just don't have the money to fix. So that process of taking the huge wealth of one city. The country's wealth is obviously starting with diamonds underneath, starting with the peoples that were stolen, slavery hit the land stolen by white settler colonialists from Europe. But it's this looting, the depletion of the mineral wealth that is just so striking because so little has been reinvested. And the G20 grappled with some of those in Johannesburg, but the G1 didn't come, and nor did other heads of state like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, his arrest warrant being the main reason, nor did Claudia Sheinbaum from Mexico, and a few others. So it was a very half-hearted G20, and it was an attempt by President Cyril Ramaphosa to draw Donald Trump into South Africa, kicking and screaming, but hopefully playing golf, as Ramaphosa kept stressing. At the end, because South Africa is committing a genocide against white Afrikaner farmers, as they say, which is the most nonsensical thing. But Trump said, I'm not going to come in because there's climate change and hunger, food security. There were geopolitical problems, all sorts of things on the agenda that Trump just didn't want to confront and didn't want to talk to the South African hosts about. He, in the end, didn't come. And Marco Rubio said, well, this is just a DEI, because look, I see climate here, and I see diversity, equity, inclusion processes in the G20. We don't want that, and when we host it it'll be the Doral Country Club in Miami in December of this year. We won't have any of that. We're paring it down. And Scott Bessent and a few of the others were sort of amplifying the sense the U.S. doesn't need South Africa. And indeed, one of the messages coming from there once Ramaphosa didn't, within that G20 meeting, hand over to a junior American diplomat, then Trump said, well, you can't come to the G20 of 2026. And the whole kind of construct of a troika in which these countries pass it along. What's particularly important about the G20 is that it has, since 2008, especially when George W. Bush in his last months in office found this meltdown in the financial markets and realized that they needed desperately to pull more middle-income countries in with their huge surpluses, hence a G7. It was in fact G8 because Putin hadn't yet invaded Crimea and hadn't been thrown out. So that G8 needed much more. So the G20 was formed. It was originally finance ministers in 1999, but in 2008 it became the heads of state. And they were meant to have this extraordinary might of bailing each other out. They did. I mean, the main bailouts were Chinese money going to the US and a few others with big surpluses that were not in the G7. And they were brought in. And that meant bringing in what are now the original, from 2010, the original BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So the G7 and the BRICS and a few others like Korea and Australia, Saudi Arabia, Argentina were brought in. And the whole point in 2008 was to have enough excess reserves and coordinated monetary policy to halt the big collapse underway. And it took them really until about 2009 to work out the modalities, quantitative easing, lower interest rates, bank bailouts, coordinated fiscal expansion, all of the things that were done to try to get a coordinated elite of imperialist powers in the G7 and the sub-imperialists from the BRICS. Now, that meant when we saw them coming through in Johannesburg and had some minor protests, we didn't have sufficient numbers in the streets, and there was a fair bit of co-optation going on. But nevertheless, we can make a very clear claim that the imperial-sub-imperial alliance isn't working very well. And that was shown just the day before the G20 began in Belém, Brazil, because of the climate summit. Now, all of this comes in the context, these failures, of a shrinkage of aid to Africa and worsening debt crises. There was one African who was especially important in Washington. He was born in Pretoria, and he grew up partly in Johannesburg and Durban. His name Elon Musk, and he's the richest man in the world after having got into first PayPal and then Tesla and X.com and SpaceX. So a huge portfolio. But that portfolio, which made him about $400 billion in personal wealth, came itself under attack by activists who were burning Teslas and people dropping out of X.com and not going for the Starlink SpaceX options. Those boycotts cost Elon Musk $110 billion out of his $400 billion in wealth. And that's a very interesting message that I hope we can maybe conclude with. What are the routes for international progressives to find some way to replicate that? Now, what with the crisis of Africa's debt, firstly, the higher interest rates that came from the Federal Reserve in 2022, and much more debt was required to get through the COVID crisis. There weren't really any proper bailout mechanisms for the catastrophe there. But also, there were then trade eruptions in 2025, and the commodity prices that had kept Africa moving at least 2020 to 2022 because of the high prices of minerals especially, those collapsed. The one exception being gold, and later another exception being platinum. Gold now $5,100 an ounce. In 2002, it was at its trough of about $250, so 20 times increase. So those increases, say gold and more recently platinum, contrast with what was happening with most of the commodities that Africa exports, and with lower aid, with higher interest rates to repay foreign debt, the debt particularly to Western banks and multilateral agencies, but also to China. 13% of sub-Saharan African debt is to the Chinese state banking system. And then on top of that, the aid cuts that particularly hit. It wasn't just Elon Musk wrecking US aid. That, by the way, hit Africa hard on access to AIDS medicines, that is antiretrovirals, that had raised all our life expectancies in the continent, in South Africa's case, from 52 to 65 between 2004 and COVID. So an extraordinary chance to do something with aid money, now lost. That was probably the greatest success, to get antiretroviral medicines off of intellectual property, to sort of disrupt global capital power, and that came partly from the treatment action campaign of activists in South Africa. So a sense there that you could make interventions at the global scale and take away at least some of the most important power, intellectual property of Western capital. And that takes us to African debt crises. So with the lower aid monies, with the higher interest rates, with the lower commodity prices, we had countries that had been really strong performers in the 2010s, like Ghana, Zambia, and Ethiopia, completely collapse as these forces took over, and in Ethiopia's case, a civil war. So those three went into default, but there were plenty of others in deep debt distress. And that meant that what South Africa needed to do last November, hosting the G20, was arrange something more durable than the little half-assed debt relief that had been given during COVID. And they failed to do that. And one reason is that the South African ruling class is very invested in Africa, not just investment and trade, but finance. And the man in charge of this is named Trevor Manuel, that Ramaphosa made the head of a commission himself as the chair of the old mutual insurance empire, and the deputy chair of the local Rothschilds himself could say, well, look, my personal interests are to have debt repaid, no debt write-off. He didn't say that, didn't declare his conflict of interest, and so we didn't get anywhere with that. Now that just puts the next part of the story, I think, into yet more poignant mode. That is that the African labor movements have been completely swamped by imports. This is really going back about 35 years to the early 90s. And as the general agreement on tariffs and trade was replaced by the World Trade Organization, many countries brought in, South Africa in 1994, as we got democracy, that meant liberalizing, and often it was way too fast. And the inability to keep our little cottage industries, clothing, textiles, footwear, appliances, electronics, and others, the labor-intensive industries that were up to about 24% of South Africa's GDP in manufacturing, they collapsed because of foreign import competition, and then also there was a long recession in the early 1990s. And when you kind of think of those forces that took the working class of South Africa, the strongest in the continent's history, when it overthrew the apartheid system with the community movements, the African National Congress in exile, solidarity activists. When you think of the extraordinary ways in which that class has been divided and conquered and co-opted, the deindustrialization process must be the most tragic, because to go from 24% of an economy in manufacturing down to 12, and the 12 that's left is actually mainly export-oriented. We can thank the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act for giving Mercedes, the big luxury car company, and BMW and Volkswagen and Toyota and I think Ford at one point was involved in it. They had the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act exports to the US of cars. Trump in February of 2025 put 25% there, and then a 50% tariff on steel and aluminum, and that's where, again, South Africa had big exports under AGOA, along with some agriculture and vineyard products. I always like to remind that when Trump is trying to defend Afrikaner farmers, what he's doing is partly rhetoric by saying you can have refugee status. The only refugees, I gather, are with white skin, and those are Afrikaners. But at the same time, the tariffs that he's put on, especially on grapes and on wines from the vineyards, have also been extremely devastating. For cars, it was resulted in an 87% crash of South African car exports to the US. Now we add the next element, which is the exports that were going from China into the US and now are being displaced and redirected into South Africa. And that brings us to the sort of debates we're having as we speak over a vast shutdown of industrial capacity, especially smelters, steel, manganese, chromium, and probably aluminium. The aluminum smelters, it really is one huge one, the biggest in the Southern Hemisphere. And when you kind of think of that huge industrial base, very electricity intensive, the coal-fired power feeding the electricity means they're extremely climate unfriendly. And that means not only the US tariffs going in when Trump he put 30% on South Africa last August, the highest in Africa. But there's an additional tariff that's starting in Europe this month, and that is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So it's to say, because South African coal feeds into the smelters that make the steel, the aluminum, and that therefore means our aluminum will be much dirtier than if we produce it, say, for example, Iceland, which has a geothermal energy, and they produce aluminum there. So therefore, what we want to do is put a new price on the imported aluminum, and that's the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And because Europe has a carbon market, it's a farcical, very volatile market that crashed 50% in 2023, for example. But anyway, that market today is pricing carbon at around $90 a ton. South Africa's carbon tax is only 30 cents a ton, so that means that the attempt to stop the outsourcing of pollution by importing the aluminum from South Africa means South Africa will be hit with this border tax. So here's a tariff that's not like a Trump tariff, which is whimsical and transactional, corrupt, and so forth. Depends on politics, as we saw with both India and Brazil getting 50% tariffs. But now this other one that comes from Europe and then next year from the UK does have a certain logic. That is, we don't want to be accused in Europe and the UK, they say, of outsourcing the emissions. So we're therefore going to make sure that if we're bringing in steel and aluminum, and the countries that send them, like South Africa, don't have a good carbon price, to address the climate crisis. Well, we will put that on. And that's led to the charges of green imperialism. But the main thing is it's helped to confound all of our thinking about internationalism. What are the internationalist requirements when a labor movement, like this great South African tradition, split largely in two? There are a few other fractions. On the one side are the big core unions, mostly now public sector, although the mine workers are still there. And that's called COSATU, Congress of South African Trade Unions. And then you get to the left unions that broke away because COSATU was too tied to the government, to the African National Congress. And that union movement is called South African Federation of Trade Unions. But it's a very complicated situation because the biggest union by far, with about 280,000 members, and a few years ago, 350,000 members, so they've completely crashed, is the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. So I'm going to talk about NUMSA and SAFTU. They're allegedly in one force, the big tensions there. On the one hand, COSATU on the other. What I think they're all in agreement, though, is, like a Sinn Féin in the UAW, we need to have tariffs, and that'll help restore some of the industrial competitiveness. Now, that means that the politics of labor internationalism is completely evacuated, because rather than reaching out, if possible, and I've seen this only once, which is in Hong Kong with the Labor Bulletin and the Globalization Monitor and a group called Borderless Hong Kong, and they hosted a Belt and Road Initiative conference, a BRICS counter-conference, where they brought in the independent Chinese labor leaders that they had identified over the years, about 150. They had to wear masks. Now, this is 2017, before COVID. And the reason was they were going to be profoundly repressed if they went back to the mainland to make this internationalism happen. So we were there with the South African delegation, Brazilians, or a few others. And it gave me a sense that even though this is a very small initiative, that is to find an independent labor left, it's absolutely what we have to do in this current context. Because if we're not careful of the way in which we extend tariffs, like South Africa's put tariffs on that 20% of goods that are flooding into places like South Africa because they're not going to the US, that means our steel, washing machines, nuts and bolts, aluminum in South Africa are being completely pounded. We've gone from about 9 million tons of steel a year, probably this year 3.5 million. So a huge decline in that industrial capacity because of the cheap imports, by and large. Also, there was problems with electricity and transport. But the main thing about this is we've got no real labor approach that could be extended, that we could call internationalists. It's very short-termist to say, well, put up the protective barriers. But it is pretty much proven that China was dumping. It was the companies making the steel and the washing machines, the nuts and bolts, the tires, and lots of other products are selling in South Africa below cost. They have just so much over-accumulated capital. They need to get rid of these excesses. I should add that this goes through waves. It was a serious problem in the early 2010s. And now it's a very, very serious problem because credit has been pushed out of the real estate sector, where it was over capacity, over accumulated, big construction companies going bankrupt, and now going into that credit going into manufacturing. And that means China last year declared a $1.1 trillion trade surplus. They've got just so much that's pouring out. So I'll conclude with this idea that the underlying Marxist theory of overproduction seems to be rearing up yet again. Usually there are ways to displace those problems. You can manage crises. They can do it more and more, for example, with the type of Fed quantitative easing, the bailouts that we saw. But what Marx talked about was speeding up the process with relative surplus value, putting more machines. And so that's one way you kind of deal with overproduction. Well, you replace the labor with machines that are more efficient, and then wipe out your competitors, and you take over the market. And that's the sort of first of the strategies. The second, absolute surplus value, you make your workers work harder. But it's the three others, because these are problems or strategies that just extend the problem. They don't solve them, they displace them. But what Rosa Luxemburg found, I could start with the theory, but might as well just finish with it because it's so important, I think, to say what would a Rosa Luxemburg do today as the premier internationalist of her era, as a communist, but someone who felt that the Second International blowing apart in 1914 over these very questions needed to be theorized. So for her, the imperialist project was capital meeting the non-capitalists, which brings us to some other new techniques. So one technique from Luxemburg is that you have a spatial fix, David Harvey's term, spatial fix, but she really described the process when there's too much produced in the West, the colonial powers, while they need their colonies to mop it up and to find cheaper production sites or sites where they can mine and ship it out more inexpensively. So you sort of see a geographical fix as capital moves across space to find a solution. The second fix we could call temporal, and Luxemburg knew about this. Marx wrote about it in Volume 3. It's basically saying the credit system can help to mop up this capital. That credit system runs into problems. Obviously, we've been hitting them since the 1980s, when Paul Volcker's Fed shock meant massive defaults. But the debt crises represent ways that capital had tried to extend the payment of goods you consume today into the future. So it's a temporal fix. You can use time through credit. You can stall the problem. So the first is you shift the problem around. The second is you stall it from being a problem now. The third is the innovation that I think Luxemburg takes most credit for. Capital finds the non-capital, and as she's put it, eats it up. And that's what David Harvey called accumulation by dispossession, which is the privatization and the looting of nature and much more extreme forms. And I'll wrap up because I think by looking at the theory of capitalist crisis formation and displacement that comes first from Marx and then I think Luxemburg and Harvey and there are a few others, and Nancy Fraser does this very, very well as well today. But when you say, okay, at some point they reach a barrier, and here's where labor has to make a choice, the barrier in which you cannot any longer displace your problem geographically. You cannot any longer add more debt. You're already maxed out. The resistance to accumulation by dispossession is rising. What it means is then you need a new approach, which is the devalorization. And the World War II devalorization was the most obvious and devastating and effective to clear out the excess capital, to shove away the old economic deadwood. Germany, Japan, and much of France and England, the industrial capacity gone, needing to be rebuilt with new relations of production. The old systems were replaced by the new technologies that allowed assembly lines and Fordist methods. So that's one approach that people think about. Okay, what is the next process for clearing out economic deadwood, introducing all the new tech and becoming more efficient? But the horrible process for workers is this devalorization that we see in the middle. And that's where I think we need to put our heads together much more. This isn't really about tariffs and protecting jobs in the short term. It's something more profound. It's about a global overaccumulation crisis and the territorial alliances. Sean Fain here with the car companies and Donald Trump getting together to put up the barriers. We've got to do better than that. We've got to figure out where an eco-socialist approach could lead to planning, nationalization of these industries. But what is most dangerous is what happened, of course, in 1914, that individual countries, working classes, will form the territorial alliances with their ruling classes and then logically go to war. I hope we're not going to see too many of the working class in MAGA fall for this. We see them still giving Donald Trump 40% support. Obviously not all workers. We're seeing an upsurge of more conscientized workers, and it's probably a layer of the reactionary petty bourgeoisie that we would need to worry about the most in MAGA, but certainly in South Africa, where our working class has picked up some of the same traits of xenophobia against workers from the rest of the African continent, leading to quite regular upsurges and pogroms and deaths and just xenophobic incidents. It's so hard to figure out then, without a Chinese working class we can relate to, what is the approach that will be most appropriate in this time where if we fall down the slippery slope of the tariffs and the other displacement techniques and now devalorization defenses, we are just playing into the hands of capital during a crisis rather than taking advantage of that. That's my 2 cents about where we are, and it's coming out in a Counterpunch and Z Network and CADTM article very soon, but I need to check in with you to see if what I'm saying makes any sense.
So I think that we have to look at this New World epic also in relationship to the decline of U.S. imperialism, because the result of the Second World War was a solidification of U.S. capitalism and the establishment of Bretton Woods and the financial arrangements that allowed for the development of the world economy, really with the WTO and the international capitalist organizations in control. And I remember I attended a press conference during an AFL-CIO convention with Clinton about he was trying to get support from the AFL-CIO, and I asked about the attack by Yeltsin on the bombing of the White House. And he said that, I said, well, the people of Russia, the workers of Russia, were angry at the bombing of the White House, and if that had happened in Washington, there would be a rebellion. And he said, no, it's better, he said, because at least the missiles are not pointed at us. So that's okay. And then I said, well, the privatization of the IMF and the World Bank had caused incredible problems for the Russian working class. Deaths, the longevity of workers declined. And he said, well, we don't control the IMF. That was we don't really control the IMF. But I think that the whole decline of U.S. imperialism has to be entered into this, and the inter-imperialist rivalries, because I think what is really happening now is that the United States is unable to compete with China, is unable to compete with other countries, and it's turning to military intervention, the Monroe Doctrine. And this is a very dangerous move towards world war, really. And I think that the attack on Venezuela is to also prevent Venezuela from trading with China. They were trading in yuan, but also to stop oil going through China. And I think the same thing is planned for Iran. I mean, to actually intervene to prevent Iran from being a supplier in the world economy. This is very dangerous globally. But the other aspect I think that we have to enter into this analysis is also the development of AI. Because I know that Goldman Sachs made a report which said 350 million workers will lose their jobs as a result of the introduction of AI. And the capitalist speculation, massive capitalist investment and speculation into data centers, into San Francisco and in these AI companies is aimed at really eliminating workers, large numbers of workers. But however, at the same time, and Trump has said he wants to bring factories, forcing these other countries like Korea and Japan to invest all this money into the United States, Taiwan. But the reality is these factories that are going to be coming in are going to be robotic. They're going to be, the number of workers are going to be very small compared to old factories, old industrial production. So there is no panacea from foreign investment into the United States with tech. And so I think that is what we have to talk about in relationship to the rise of fascism. Because what is the solution for capitalists in which they have no future economically? They're going to war with each other, the profit is declining, and actually the introduction of AI increases the decline of profit because, number one, their money is going into the capital, not to the workers. And number two, who are the workers who are going to be buying these products for an exchange of surplus value for more profit? So those two things combined really present another dilemma, contradiction for capitalism in this new world order, if you want, or the emerging world crisis and trauma that the capitalism of the world economy is going through. And I agree with you as well that the Chinese working class are central to this. That what we're today seeing is the rebellion or the anger of people in Minneapolis, of the working class, and the call on January 23rd for a work stoppage, a work community stoppage that was successful. There was a march of 50,000. It wasn't the unions going out as organizations, but it showed the potential for mass working class community action. And I think that is going to grow, actually. And the development of a mass working class movement in the United States offers tremendous opportunity to link up with the Chinese working class. In other words, the political development of the working class in the United States in a work towards workers' control, towards a labor party, towards a political development with a working class solution is an opportunity to link up with the workers of the world. And I think that is the hope which we really need, because there's no solution under a capitalist framework. That's really what we're saying. And that is the experience of Africa and the development of Africa. And I want to also say I have some experience supporting the Namibian workers, the South African workers, the Durban 50th anniversary that took place, and in Namibia, which is an example of Chinese penetration. It has basically been captured. SWAPO has been captured by the Chinese. They built their headquarters at SWAPO. They've taken over the largest uranium mines, lithium mines, and the Usab mine. They've gotten rid of the union leaders at Rossing, that mine. They're eliminating, and they captured all road construction in Namibia. So you have Chinese workers. I mean, the thought of it, Chinese workers going into Africa to replace African workers is really a crime, on an attack on the African working class, which needs industrial development. And of course, the investment of China, as you have pointed out, is a investment to get resources out of Africa, to build railroads to bring the resources out, to build ports to bring the resources out, which is really, in the end, not leading to the industrial development. And of course, the destruction of Libya, which had a plan, Gaddafi had a plan with all his faults, he had a plan for the development of Africa, were just exploded by the invasion and destruction of Libya, which encouraged fundamentalism and has really helped to break up and deepen the crisis of Africa. So I think these are some important questions.
And you're describing this inter-imperial and an internecine battle of capitals, and that's where I think the trade wars are best understood. The crucial dilemma is where multipolar advocates believe that a better capitalism can be fashioned through the BRICS, and we hear a lot of that, of course, in South Africa. In fact, the unions are some of the main purveyors of this hope. They have a BRICS Trade Union Forum, BTUF, and of course, some of the members, especially China, also Russia, are not really independent unions. They're obviously under the state's thumb. But the main point is there's a hope that in inter-imperial rivalry between capitalist states, China and other BRICS on the one hand, and the US, there's going to be a weakening of the US, and a multipolar alternative to unipolar Western power will emerge. And this sense that we should look at capitalism through the eyes of state conflicts, and we should be cheering for the less dominant forces of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus 5 new BRICS, one being Indonesia, another Egypt, another UAE, just remember those 3, and the last 2 being Ethiopia and Iran. But aside from Ethiopia and Iran, those other 3, Egypt and the UAE and Indonesia, have just joined Donald Trump's Board of Peace, putting $1 billion. And it means that the divide and conquer of the BRICS is still profound. I mean, we see the BRICS this year hosted by Narendra Modi in India. It may be that he and Trump will have their tete-a-tete that they missed last October and resolve this problem of that 50% tariff, and that they agree they'll buy more Harley Davidsons from the U.S. as the sort of, way to balance their trade surpluses. But the major dilemma for anyone doing this interstate rivalry is that these BRICS are not standing up for each other. So as we speak, the U.S. Aircraft carriers and the fighter jets are positioning to do something to Iran. Well, what did the BRICS do back when the U.S. hit those 3 nuclear enrichment sites in June in the middle of a 12-day war? They did nothing. And one reason, I think, is, if you go to Russia and you sort of say, well, a lot of Russian Jews had been oppressed during the Soviet period. Well, they took the first chance. They moved to Israel. In fact, it's represented about 2 million of the 7 million Jewish residents of Israel. According to Putin, they're Russian citizens, and you can't kind of mess with your citizens even if they've left. He says so. He's not doing anything to stop coal sales and oil facilitation to Israel. Likewise, China has a major stake in Israel, such as the ports. The port of Haifa, the biggest port, is co-owned. The Bayside, or it's called Bayport, which is the big container terminal, is Chinese. The Shanghai state-owned company, the Adani company from India, owns the rest of that major container unloading site. So they're the ones, sort of facilitating the kind of material going into Israel that the IDF needs. And then you've got others. South Africa is the only coal supplier to Israel at this point. Colombia broke. Russia may be shipping again to Israel. We'll have to look. And then you've also got Brazil. 9% of the oil that goes to Israel is from Petrobras indirectly, so we have comrades in Brazil trying to stop that. But you can get a sense that there's not an anti-imperial feature within this BRICS, if we just use that one case. Another one where I have a long essay coming out this week is climate, because the BRICS and the G7 have exactly the same interest. I should say G6, because the G1 just ran away from climate, denying it. But they have three very simple interests, and we saw that in Belém in Brazil. Number one, they don't want to cut emissions enough to save the planet and leave the oil in the soil and fossil fuels untouched. Number two, they don't want to admit they emitted. That is, they don't want to say, we're going to pay our climate debt, polluter pays, reparations. They're not going to do that. And that's, again, the West and the BRICS agreeing 100%. And then we have the third, which is they want to privatize the air. That is, the carbon markets, emissions trading and offsets and things. So none of these are going to stand up in some international court of justice, where last July they ruled 27 little kids from Tuvalu, little island that's sinking, have intergenerational rights, so that the rights that they have to survive need to be considered, and then there should be reparations. But I think we're going to see that kind of huge conflict between those who pollute. A lot of people say, well, the problem is the global north is entirely to blame for the climate crisis, and the global south, including our BRICS, are the ones to take us forward. Well, if you unpack the data and look even per person, historic, correct for colonialism, actually the BRICS are more destructive. They have 51% of the current emissions, producing only 29% of output. This is before the next five joined. So what I'm getting at is that there's a crucial new distinction that originally in 1965, when the term was used, sub-imperialism, it was applied by Rui Marini to Brazil. Turkey was considered a sub-imperial power, Israel, of course, Saudi Arabia, white South Africa. But now we've got in the BRICS forces that might talk against imperialism, but they walk with imperialism. They're sub-imperial. And I think that speaks to your point that this is not going to be a project of the left that will be resolved with some big replacement of the U.S. with some new hegemon. Obviously, China has the greatest chance. But there's something much bigger at stake now, which is that you can't trust the leaders of the BRICS in this rhetorical multipolar mode, because again and again they just shore up the system. The last point is that they are the ones who gave the IMF huge new flows of funds in 2015. And as the BRICS rose up, well, they stood on the heads of the likes of Venezuela, which was pushed down 41% in its voting power. And I think that says it all, doesn't it? It's not about new BRICS leaders coming in, taking control of these multilaterals. It's about, so far, maybe it'll change, playing the game, not ever really talking about the necessary de-dollarization to balance out the world economy, so we have a better trade system. We don't rely on a Federal Reserve that quantitative eases one day and puts up interest rates the next, or puts on all sorts of sanctions against its enemies. And that means, I think, Steve, just to wrap up, sorry to be so long-winded, that a politics that has to come from below of internationalism, I think, has to be more aware than ever that there aren't two categories of global north and global south, but that rather we've got capitalists from the middle powers, the BRICS, that are even more exploitative in the global value chains, even more willing to take child labor from Congo and take the coltan and the cobalt and lithium that's supplied. And then the hukou system in China that puts rural workers at such a disadvantage. And if you kind of go through all the ways in which super exploitative processes, to use Marini's phrasing about Brazil, super exploitative processes characterize BRICS labor relations, with some exceptions. Obviously, there's been a big fight for justice from workers in South Africa and Brazil, and India, but in China and Russia, no, they're really so repressed. And I hope we're going to find a way around that, because it seems to me that a lot of the global left has put their hope in a multipolar myth. And one of our jobs, I think, has to be working with the laborers who are trying to make links and understanding the limits of that particular discourse. They need the new ones in a G20, right? As I say, there is a vehicle to co-opt and assimilate into imperialism these new players. But maybe Turkey is one of the more interesting ones, Saudi Arabia, because they're on the fence. And when Trump said, everyone's dropping out of the BRICS, he meant Argentina, which with Javier Milei, the right wing, they sort of declined at 2023.
Still trading with China, though.
Yeah, and also Saudi Arabia was going to BRICS meetings but never officially joined. Turkey and Algeria were given invitations to join the BRICS as partners, second class, and they have not replied. They haven't accepted that. They both wanted, sort of full membership. So it's a very fluid situation, and the main problem about whether Trump taking on an Iran here and a Venezuela there, maybe it'll be Colombia next, Cuba certainly Rubio wants to do. Cuba, by the way, is a member of the BRICS partner countries. It's not a full member, but a partner. Bolivia as well, even though it's turned to the right. So it's a very mixed up situation. There's no overarching logic. I mean, Venezuela tried to be in the BRICS, and Lula, the Brazilian president, canceled it. Then, as I say, with the new Trump Board of Peace having in it three of the second generation BRICS, UAE and Egypt and what was the third? Indonesia. You're finding, everyone hedging their bets. So I don't think we're going to see a coherent bloc. And as I say, when Iran was bombed, BRICS did nothing. When these threats come through, the tariffs. And last September, Lula held a meeting about tariffs, so they didn't do anything. When there's a chance to de-dollarize, to say, well, here's an alternative for trade, but also for investment, and we don't need the dollar mediating everything, the BRICS all backed down. And their own internal bourgeoisies didn't want to see that sort of disruption. The financial elites in Johannesburg or Sao Paulo or Mumbai and Shanghai had enough pressure to stop the process of the politicians talking about de-dollarization. They don't really talk about it, except a few little very minor things. And I think that means we're going to be looking at not the BRICS as some sort of savior, but ultimately so well integrated into Western capital, with the obvious exception of Iran. Iran doesn't deal with Israel, but all the other BRICS do, the full members. And I think at that level, we are going to have to figure out, well, what is our BRICS from below, a G20 from below. The potentials are enormous, because the hatred in the world of anything to do with Donald Trump, him hosting the G20, for example, already expelling South Africa, that hostility has to be turned into things like the BDS, the boycott of Elon Musk's products, and just to show that the societies out there won't be drinking their Coke and eating McDonald's and all the other things that come across our desk as sort of the consumer items we can BDS. But it also means BDSing the World Cup. And it might be that is just happening as a matter of course, since a lot of the team's fans won't be able to get visas because they're in the shit list of Donald Trump. So BDS might be, in one of these interesting conjunctures, crucial enough. We know that Trump does react. Trump always chickens out to China on the tariff increases, met with the threat of boycotting sales of rare earth minerals, but also that we could be doing something much more to say, as Canadians, are doing pretty regularly still. I think we won't buy any U.S. products, and delinking as Samir Amin put it, delinking parts of our economy from the circuits of capital that are most dangerous. I found those circuits of capital in big pharma really murderous, right? They're killing because they denied access to AIDS, and then comrades took them on and defeated them. There are other circuits that are even more destructive, finance. And occasionally, a country will say, well, we're going to put on exchange controls. China can do it. It did it a couple of times in the mid-2010s to stop runs on China, big stock market crashes. There are all kinds of other ways that states could intervene, but we've got to be more surgical in identifying why we want them to and why we need to isolate the U.S. The Berkeley historian and labor economist, Robert Reich, has a brand new column precisely calling for this kind of BDS against the U.S. So it would be very interesting if, in a place like Turkey, Erdogan, would not want to support this. In South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa would not want to support this, but that doesn't mean we can't be pushing from below.
I have a much more, I would say, different view as far as the crisis of world imperialism, because I actually think there's going to be a major crash in depression. One of the things that we haven't talked about is the deregulation of the financial markets, the whole massive speculation in cryptocurrency, and putting David Sachs, this billionaire techno-fascist, in charge of digital development in the United States, taking off any kind of control that would Glass-Steagall, of course, was gotten rid of by Clinton, but what's going on now is even a further deregulation of the financial economy. So I believe there's going to be a crash even bigger than 2008. And I don't think they're going to be able to get out of it without a massive industrial financial collapse. I mean, the dollar now, tied to gold at $5,000 an ounce of gold, more than $5,000 an ounce, it portends a very bad economic situation and a withdrawal from the United States. That's the first point I want to make around that. The second point is the decline of U.S. imperialism and the adventurism of Trump is a reflection of that decline. And the idea that you can resuscitate American capitalism by tariffs and on different countries around the world is not going to save the United States, number one. All it's doing is furthering the destruction of any normal trade agreements globally. It's one man deciding, these tariffs. It's creating chaos in a global world economy. In fact, the capitalists now are saying, some capitalists, well, we have to basically move away from the global economy and multinationals and global development. Well, what does that mean for the United States? The United States has based its wealth on its ability internationally to invest capital.
Well, and especially to get the intellectual property.
To get intellectual property.
Royalties, the financing.
The finance. But in my view, the other aspect of it is that this is war. The attack on Venezuela was an act of war against China, because what did they say? China's invested over $10 billion into development of the oil industry in Venezuela. Now it's being controlled by the United States. How are they going to be paid back? They were being paid back by the export of oil from Venezuela to China. That's off the table. Trump has said no more oil to China, or it's going to go in the world market, which means how is China going to be paid back for its investment? But beyond that, I think that they're trying to do militarily what they haven't been able to do economically. That is what imperialism does. When you can't solve your problems economically, you have to go to military intervention. So that means we're moving towards world war and a military confrontation, an inter-imperialist war. I mean, I think that's what is going on. I mean, this attack on Canada to make it a colony of the United States, the attack on Europe, that Europe has to kowtow. And I agree with you that actually now Germany is dependent, 60% of their energy now is dependent on gas from the United States. So they've totally wrapped themselves in the United States, which can use its pressure point to threaten Germany now. I think we're going towards a global economic collapse. It's not sustainable, what we're in now. And that's going to lead to radical conditions, depression conditions in the advanced capitalist countries, which are going to lead to even further anger and class struggle in the European countries. The other thing that I think is very important to talk about is that the capitalists now are saying that the major production that's going to take place, jobs if you want, is going to be military production. So in Germany now, they're telling the working class, if you want jobs, this is what the union bureaucracy is telling the working class, if you want jobs, it has to be in military production. And in the United States, Trump has proposed expanding the $1 trillion military budget to 50% to $1.5 trillion. That is a drive towards world war. But also the solution to the economic crisis, the decline of profit, and their lack of competitivity is to go to military production, as Germany did to get out of its depression. And I think that's really what we're facing. We're facing a situation post-war, before the World War I. Those are the economic conditions which I think exist now, and very dangerous conditions, but at the same time, in the working class in the United States, a very radicalization of the working class, where young people see no future in capitalism. They look to socialism as the only solution for a future. They're living with their parents, they can't get regular jobs, and they're working the gig economy. So all these contradictions are leading to a political development of the working class.
If though, Steve, the 2008, well, really 9 to 12, quantitative easing and lower interest rates and bailouts, and the 2020 to 2021 version of the same thing, right? If those did show the Fed that they can get away with pumping money into the system, and the British central bank and the Europeans and the Japanese join them, then you may be wrong. In other words, that this crisis can be papered over or displaced at least one more time. And we haven't done, I think, enough to say, well, if they do that and they do their bailouts, once AI crashes in Wall Street and a few other places, then, well, what should our working class be doing to internationalize? Because as it stands, I think they're going to, basically, their union elites are going to be in defense of what you've said. Tariffs and the new militarization. Just one asterisk, one little point from a meeting last month at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Berlin that I went to, and that was that the leader of IG Metall and the sort of technical research leader told us that the IG Metall, the German metal workers, isn't in favor of this shift especially to Rheinmetall, because it is growing and it has no morals. The support they've given to Israel is formidable. So I think that means we should, South Africa has a Denel Rheinmetall. It's organized by the metal workers, NUMSA. So lots of contradictions, I think, hit us in that. My gut feel, though, is they still have at least one more round of this QE potential. Maybe, Amit, you worked in the Fed, you have a sense, can they print money again really fast?
I'm sure they are doing it.
Okay, we're talking about hyperinflation, because if you print money, print money in the United States, the dollar, $1,000, like $5,000 or $5,100 to an ounce of gold. I mean, this is, so you're talking about, in 2008, there was the possibility of printing money. I mean, because of the global economic and the power of the United States, it was able to sustain itself, and it printed trillions of dollars. Now that's unsustainable. Well, you're going to have hyperinflation in the United States.
Yet we know from the last two times they did QE, the hyperinflation actually isn't in the product markets that consumers face. It's in finance, and it means your hyperinflation is stock markets still being, ridiculously overvalued, and that the rich just get richer and richer. So I don't know yet that I'm as confident as you saying they won't be able to displace it. They did in 2008-9, and they did it in 2020, and that's under conditions of two different kinds of
But Trump wasn't in power then.
Yeah, but Trump does want that. He wants a bailout. He also loves that the dollar is going down. He's not opposed to that, because his rudimentary theory is if the dollar goes down, then we're going to have less imports, we're going to have more exports, we'll get our manufacturing back. That nonsense, like all the other funny myths he likes to spread, is still probably a factor in what I suspect will be Federal Reserve Governor Kevin Hassett, my former classmate from undergrad in Philadelphia, Swarthmore College, economics, and I think that's going to be just more obsequious money printing by a Fed, and I suspect the same will occur in the British, the Frankfurt, the Tokyo, the central banks.
But that means more money printing means more inflation.
But the question is, where is it? Is the inflation, because the benefits go to the rich, so the inflation's in assets. It's not a price inflation.
Well, but for the working class, inflation is going to be devastating, and that's,
well, sector by sector, the healthcare inflation, the managed care premiums have gone up 100%, but we haven't really felt, okay, that's worth everyone's energy and efforts. But
that's part of the inflation. I mean, I don't. We're talking about an epic change, and I think that the epic we're in now, with imperialism, inter-imperialist rivalry, with the crisis of the capital that we face, is not going to be resolved without war. I don't see it resolved without war, and I think that that's where we're going. I don't want to see it. And also for those, and there are many in the United States who didn't believe we could have a fascist movement here, or that we have a fascist government. But that is the reality. I mean, the techno-fascists are in charge of the state.
Monitoring everything in the society.
Everything in the state. These people need a fascist program, which is what Project 2025 is, to grab wealth, to privatize everything, and to create for them a fascist regime that can resolve their crisis. That is not going to resolve their crisis. Yeah. I mean, fascism won't resolve the crisis of capitalism, but that's their ideology, that it will resolve it. And I think what they are doing, though, and this is in Europe and in the United States, is they're creating a massive politicalization of the working class. And, the unions here are terrified. The union bureaucracy is terrified, because they have no answer.
Well,
they asked Liz Schuler, the president of the AFL-CIO, she said, we're not yet ready for a general strike. We have to do more education.
Well,
not are they not ready, they're terrified of a general strike.
Yeah, they endorse the class snuggle, not class struggle approach to trade unionism, and that obviously will continue until we have forces that are going to pull them kicking and streaming to the left. Or it may mean that we do more to find other kinds of networks, new networks that link labor, community, environment. Because I think what Mamdani did as the most encouraging sign I've seen in the U.S., aside from these big mobilizations on behalf of the Minneapolis victims of Trump's fascist forces. But what I think was being done in the circuits of bottom-up organizing over the period we're talking about now really has to ramp up. And if we've got traditions like anti-apartheid, where dock workers here in San Francisco were in unity, we've got a major potential, I think, to open up discussions of internationalism that would go against these unions. And leaders
I actually think internationalism is going to grow.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things, I remember at one time, no, don't cut it.
Leave it on?
Yeah, leave it on. I remember at one time, to talk about internationalism in the United States, you were accused of being a communist.
Yeah.
That was, you were a communist if you talk about internationalism. Now workers know that they're connected internationally, and these multinationals are connected internationally, and that workers are being pitted against each other. I remember speaking in Ankara at the Electrical Engineers Conference, where I gave a report on the role of technology and the internet in exploitation of workers. And after the presentation, a young guy came up, a young engineer, said, "Can you give this presentation in China?" So I said, "Why is that? I work for a Chinese company. They need to hear this in China."
So the one effort being made in this country that inspired the whole world last November was the fusion of politics of class and affordability with identity in the form of Zoran Mamdani's win. Does that send thrills through labor, organized or non-organized?
I think what it shows is that the working class and the people are willing to move to the left. They don't see any solution from Trump and the Republicans. And I think also the growth of the DSA, they organized a movement, and they organized a successful movement. I think that can grow, but I think that the plan, I think, of the fascists to cut short. I mean, what we have to recognize is that there's a tremendous anger in this country against Trump growing, even among people who voted for him, who are not likely to vote for him again. And I think that the talk about the Insurrection Act and martial law is very real, and I don't expect there to be an election in the midterms. And that means that the question of a general strike, a national general strike prior to the midterms, is absolutely critical. And the campaign now in the United States has to be that one of the reasons for a general strike is to make sure that we have an election in the United States. I mean, we have to take that up politically.
Defense of democracy.
In defense of, democratic rights. We have a right to an election, and there has to be a general strike to make sure that we can have an election, because he just today brought the FBI into Atlanta to go into the Department of Elections to grab material. They're preparing for canceling the election and using these goons to take over the ballot box. In fact, he said that one of his mistakes was he didn't seize the ballot box in Georgia. He actually said that. That was one of his mistakes. And now that he has state power, what's to prevent him from doing that?
Yeah. And the other feature, I suspect, is the potential for right-wing leaders revolt. And I'm thinking of Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene, the kind of characters who see that the divisions that they thought were constructive, that is between Trump's paleo-conservative no war, but plus xenophobia and all the rest, on the one hand, and the Rubio neocon isn't going to be a divide. It's in fact, they found ways around that obvious contradiction, keeping Tulsi Gabbard out of the picture, or finding ways to say, look, we're not going to lose any troops in invading Venezuela, has allowed Trump to flex these military muscles. I hope that can be stopped, and I think it may mean a divide and conquer, and it may mean finding ways that the far right narratives of Marjorie Taylor Greene and the Tucker Carlson and the late Charlie Kirk, who didn't like the Israel sort of connections, those have to be worked on. We never want to endorse those kind of people, but how do we help?
I think there's a split in that movement, the right-wing movement, of isolationists, nationalists, who are saying that they don't want the United States entangled in wars. And I think but they don't control the state. It's the techno-fascists, the billionaires.
Well, they call it, they call it in Washington the blob being the Pentagon, the State Department,
That's right.
the think tanks, the sort of military-industrial complex.
And they don't control the state. So the other thing that raises the issue of ending the midterms, if they do, and when they do, try to cancel the elections, that's going to create havoc internationally, because that will further escalate the decline of the U.S. dollar and a financial panic, because the political situation in the United States with the cancellation of an election will create a tremendous fear internationally that the United States is indeed collapsing. It's a civil war. It can't be relied on. And how are you going to have any kind of financial stability if there's an internal civil war in the United States?
Yeah, hopefully it means that then you stop so much emphasis on export to the U.S. and you kind of realize, well, there's a lot of things that even Europe could do to bring Trump back into line. We did see that with his retreat in Davos from the Greenland sort of expedition, but I suspect that was mostly the Wall Street jitters and the.
Well, the Europeans said we're going to start moving against you, and these tech companies that sell products in Europe. I mean, they probably said, they're going to go after us in Europe. But I'm saying the rigidity of the American capitalist structure means that they're not going to get Trump out peacefully. Trump is not going peacefully. And that means that there has to be a movement that actually force him out. And that may happen with a split in the military, because the military at this point, I believe, is very angry. All the military around the world are being attacked by people. People are very angry. They want the military out. In Europe, I mean, when they talk about breaking NATO, they're talking about closing bases, U.S. bases in Germany, in England, many countries. And so I think even in Korea now, the United States is saying, well, maybe we can't be in Korea. And actually, Korea just announced an agreement to have a super bullet train from Beijing to Seoul going through North Korea, which would be a big development. I mean, they should have that. But I think the weakness of U.S. imperialism now, they can't stop it. And my view is this year is going to be a breaking point for the development of U.S. capitalism with the election and everything else. I mean, it's coming to a head, and that is going to create incendiary conditions internationally. The financial markets, the whole post-war economic structure is collapsing in front of our faces. And what are you going to replace it with? As you say, this multipolar financial arrangement with BRICS was supposed to be an alternative. It really is not.
It's
and
not
that's
at all, yeah.
it's a capitalist financial structure, but it's not an alternative to the U.S. capitalist structure. And that is the real crisis which people have to confront. There is no financial alternative within the framework of BRICS and U.S. capitalist institutions.
Yeah, and I can go into all the detail to defend you on that because I've studied this BRICS New Development Bank and the non-existent contingent reserve arrangement alternative to the IMF and the credit rating agency and all the kind of gimmicks that are coming out of BRICS. We will do this, and they never get around to it. Well, that's a fantastic way to think through.
Well, thank you all for joining us, and we've covered the world and the future, and I think these issues obviously are really critical for the world working class, and the necessity of the working class to seize society and to build a new world of plenty for people and of a climate that we can survive in, and the development of a peaceful world where the world can survive and humanity can survive. So thank you for joining us.